The storm that night did not simply fall upon Blackwood Kingdom. It settled over it, thick and unrelenting, as though the sky itself understood that something irreversible was about to happen and had decided to weep before anyone else could. This is the story of a king who believed his crown made him untouchable, and a woman who understood, long before he did, that no throne in the world can protect a family once trust has quietly begun to erode from the inside. This is not simply a love story. It is a story about the cost of pride, the weight of silence, and the terrifying distance that can grow between two people who never once stopped loving each other. Before we go further, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. To understand how far Adrian Blackwood would eventually fall, you must first understand the world that shaped him long before Mara ever entered his life. Adrian was born inside a palace built on centuries of conquest, a place where love was rarely spoken of and even more rarely trusted. His father, King Alaric Blackwood, ruled with a closed fist and a colder heart, teaching his son from the earliest years that mercy was a weakness reserved for lesser men. Adrian's mother had died when he was only 8 years old, and in the years that followed, he learned to bury every soft feeling beneath layers of discipline and command, because in that palace, softness had a way of being punished. By the time Adrian was crowned Alpha King at the age of 26, he had already buried more grief than most men carry across an entire lifetime. He commanded thousands of wolves without hesitation. He negotiated treaties that reshaped the balance of power across neighboring territories. He was, in every sense the council understood, exactly the kind of ruler Blackwood Kingdom required. What the council did not expect was for their king to fall in love with a woman who owed her position to nothing but her own competence. Mara had come to the palace as a healer's assistant, trained under one of the kingdom's most respected physicians, a woman who had taken her in after Mara's own family had been lost during a border conflict years earlier. She had no noble bloodline. She had no political alliance to offer. She had only her intelligence, her steadiness under pressure, and an unwillingness to flatter anyone, including the king himself. Their first real conversation happened, of all places, in a hallway outside the royal infirmary, where Adrian had come seeking updates on an injured soldier. Mara had been blunt with him in a way none of his advisors ever dared to be. Your soldier will live, your majesty, but only because he was lucky enough to be brought here before you decided sending reinforcements was more important than sending medical aid. Adrian had stared at her, stunned by the audacity, before something unexpected happened. He laughed. It was the first time in longer than he could remember that laughter had come to him without effort. Over the following months, their paths crossed more frequently than either of them would admit was intentional. Adrian found himself inventing reasons to visit the infirmary. Mara found herself remembering small details about his preferences, the way he took his tea, the particular tension that gathered in his shoulders whenever council matters weighed on him. Neither spoke of what was growing between them. Not at first, because both understood exactly how the palace would react. When Adrian finally admitted his feelings to her, standing beneath the old oak tree in the palace's eastern courtyard as the sun set behind the mountains, Mara had been the one to voice the fear neither of them wanted to acknowledge. "They will never accept me," she told him quietly. "I have no lineage worth mentioning. I bring nothing to this kingdom but myself." Adrian had taken her hand in his, something he rarely allowed himself to do in a world where every gesture was studied for political meaning. "Then I will bring you as my choice," he told her, "not as a political calculation, not as an alliance, as the one thing in this entire kingdom I chose for myself, and myself alone." They married quietly, against considerable resistance from the council, and for a time, it seemed as though love truly had won against every obstacle placed before it. But love, as Mara would come to understand in the years that followed, is rarely enough on its own to protect a family from those who measure worth only in bloodlines, alliances, and a careful architecture of power. The council never accepted her, not truly. They tolerated her presence the way one tolerates a storm they cannot yet control, waiting patiently, always patiently, for circumstances to shift in their favor. Chief among these patient men was Elder Magnus Rowan, a man whose calm demeanor concealed an ambition sharper than any blade forged in Blackwood's armories. Magnus had never forgiven Adrian for rejecting the political marriage the council had arranged years earlier, a union that would have bound the Blackwood throne to House Rowan through Magnus' own daughter, Celeste. When Adrian chose Mara instead, Magnus did not respond with open anger. He responded with something far more dangerous. He waited. He waited through the early years of Adrian and Mara's marriage, watching for any sign of instability he might exploit. He waited as Mara struggled, quietly and privately, with the isolation of being a queen the nobility refused to fully embrace. And when Mara became pregnant, Magnus recognized immediately what this pregnancy could mean, not simply for Adrian's legacy, but for the ancient bloodline gift that ran through the Blackwood family, a gift so rare that only a handful of heirs across generations had ever been confirmed to carry it. The moment physicians confirmed Mara was carrying twins, Magnus began setting a plan into motion so patient, so carefully constructed, that even Adrian's closest advisors remained unaware of its true scope. Mara, for her part, spent the final months of her pregnancy trying to build a nursery filled with warmth in a palace that often felt cold in every sense but temperature. She carved a small wooden wolf toy herself during the long, sleepless nights when Adrian was consumed by council business, choosing to fill her hands with something gentle rather than allow her mind to dwell on the whispers that followed her through palace corridors. When Lucas and Lyra were born on a snow-covered morning in the depths of winter, something inside Adrian shifted in a way even he had not anticipated. The ruthless Alpha King who could command armies without hesitation found himself utterly disarmed by two small, fragile lives that depended entirely on him. He held Lucas for nearly an hour on the first night home from the birthing chambers, refusing to hand him to a nurse even as his arms grew tired, simply because the infant had finally stopped crying against his chest. Mara watched from the doorway, amused by the sight of a man capable of leading armies utterly undone by a newborn's tears. "You're holding him too tightly," she told him gently. "I am not," Adrian insisted, though his expression betrayed uncertainty. "You are. I'm the Alpha King. That does not make you an expert in newborns." He looked down at Lucas, then back at her, something softer than she had ever seen crossing his features. "Apparently not." She laughed, and it was one of those small, ordinary moments she would later cling to during the darkest days of what followed, proof that whatever happened, whatever the council attempted to take from them, this love had been real. But happiness inside a royal palace rarely remains untouched for long, and Mara began noticing changes almost immediately after the twins' birth. The nurses grew nervous in her presence, exchanging glances they thought she did not see. Council members fell silent whenever she entered rooms where they had clearly been discussing something they did not wish her to hear. In 3 days before the twins were born, Mara discovered that someone had accessed the royal nursery's private medical records without her authorization. When she brought this to Adrian, exhaustion and distraction colored his response. "It's probably the council being the council," he told her. "I'll deal with it." "You always say that," she replied, the frustration slipping out before she could stop it. His expression hardened instantly. What is that supposed to mean? Mara immediately regretted her words, understanding how easily exhaustion could be mistaken for accusation. But beneath her frustration lived something far more difficult to name: fear. She understood Adrian's power intimately, had witnessed it firsthand in council chambers and diplomatic negotiations alike. But she had also come to understand something he had not yet fully accepted. Power does not guarantee safety, especially when the people surrounding that power are patient enough and clever enough to manipulate it from within. The morning Adrian left for his meeting at the Royal Crescent Hotel, Mara found another warning waiting for her. A folded piece of paper slipped beneath the nursery door sometime in the early hours, containing no name, no seal, only 4 words written in unfamiliar handwriting. Don't trust the council. Her heart began to race as she looked toward the sleeping twins, understanding with sudden clarity that whatever was unfolding around her family had moved beyond mere political tension. This was something deliberate, something with a plan behind it. When Adrian entered the nursery moments later, dressed in his formal black coat, exhaustion visible in the lines around his eyes, Mara quickly folded the paper into her palm, uncertain whether sharing it would help or simply deepen the divide already forming between them. "You're awake," he observed. "I couldn't sleep," she replied. He approached the cradles, studying his children in the quiet morning light. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the tension from recent days settling comfortably into silence rather than confrontation. Then Adrian gently touched Lyra's tiny hand. "She has your fingers," he said softly. Mara smiled despite everything weighing on her. "And Lucas has your stubbornness." "Already?" "Definitely." He almost smiled, the ghost of amusement crossing his tired features before reality reasserted itself. Then his expression shifted entirely. "I have to leave," he told her. Her smile disappeared instantly. "Where?" "The Royal Crescent Hotel." "Why?" Elder Rowan requested a private meeting. Her stomach tightened at the mention of his name. "About the Eastern Alliance?" "Yes." She hesitated before asking the question that had been building inside her for weeks. "Is Celeste going to be there?" Adrian did not answer immediately, and in that silence, Mara found the answer she feared most. Mara looked away, the weight of everything she had been carrying finally beginning to show. Celeste Rowan was the daughter of one of the kingdom's most powerful elders, and for months the council had quietly pushed the idea that Adrian required a political marriage with her, one capable of solidifying alliances Mara's own presence had never been able to secure. Mara had always known the council disliked her. She had not been born into one of the kingdom's great bloodlines. She had not been selected for political reasons. Adrian had chosen her, freely and without calculation, and that single fact made her more dangerous to the council than any rival house ever could have been. "Do you trust me?" Mara finally asked. Adrian looked at her, something almost wounded in his expression at the question itself. "Of course." "Then why does it feel like everyone else is deciding what happens to our family?" His face hardened in response. "Because you're exhausted. I'm your wife," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "And you're 7 days postpartum," he replied, the words landing harder than he likely intended. "I know what I am," she said quietly, stepping away from him. He sighed, reaching for patience he did not fully possess in that moment. "Mara." "No," she said, cutting him off. "Go to your meeting." Adrian stared at her for a long moment, something inside him wanting desperately to stay, to set aside the meeting entirely and simply remain with his family. But pride, that familiar companion that had guided so much of his life, ultimately won out over instinct. "I'll be back tonight," he told her, and left the nursery without another word. Neither of them understood. In that ordinary and painful moment, that it would be the last time Adrian would see his wife for what would eventually stretch into 7 long years. At the Royal Crescent Hotel, Adrian sat across from Elder Magnus Rowan in a private meeting room designed for exactly this kind of quiet, calculated conversation. Beside Magnus sat Celeste, composed and elegant, watching Adrian with an expression that revealed nothing of the plan already set into motion around them. "Your Majesty," Magnus began, "the Eastern Alliance is ready for your signature." Adrian barely listened, his mind lingering on the tension he had left behind in the nursery. "You wanted something else," he said, cutting directly to the point. Magnus allowed a small smile. "Always direct." "I don't have time for games," Adrian replied. Celeste leaned forward slightly. "You're right," she said. "The council wants certainty." Adrian's eyes narrowed. "Certainty about what?" "Your succession," Magnus answered plainly. Adrian understood immediately what was being suggested. "You want me to marry Celeste?" Magnus did not bother denying it. "The kingdom needs stability, Your Majesty." "My children provide stability," Adrian countered. "Your children are infants," Magnus replied evenly. "They are heirs," Adrian said, his patience thinning. "And your wife?" Magnus asked, the question deliberately pointed. Adrian's expression shifted immediately, something protective rising in his voice. "My wife does not need their acceptance." "Perhaps not," Celeste said softly, "but you need theirs." The words struck Adrian harder than he expected, cutting straight to a truth he had spent years trying to avoid confronting directly. Before he could formulate a response, 3 sharp knocks echoed against the door, delivered in the unmistakable rhythm of military urgency. Adrian turned toward the sound immediately. "Come in." The door opened, and Beta Marcus stepped inside, his face drained of color in a way that immediately set Adrian's instincts on edge. "What happened?" Adrian demanded. Marcus glanced briefly toward Celeste before speaking. "Your Majesty, I need to speak with you privately." Adrian's voice hardened. "Say it." Marcus hesitated only a moment longer before delivering the words that would shatter everything Adrian believed about his own control over the situation. "Queen Mara has left the palace." Adrian stared at him, disbelief written across his face. "What?" "She left before dawn." "Why wasn't I informed immediately?" "We didn't know," Marcus admitted. "You didn't know my wife was gone?" Adrian's voice rose sharply. Marcus lowered his gaze. "Her chambers were sealed under postpartum recovery protocol." "Who authorized that?" Adrian demanded, his voice now carrying the unmistakable weight of command. "We're investigating," Marcus replied. "Where are my children?" Adrian asked, each word deliberate and cold. Marcus hesitated again, and in that hesitation, Adrian felt something inside him begin to crack. "Where are my children?" he repeated, stepping closer. "She took them," Marcus finally answered. Adrian froze completely, the room around him seeming to fall away entirely. Celeste rose slowly from her seat. "Perhaps she's simply upset," she offered. Adrian turned toward her, and whatever expression crossed his face silenced her instantly. "She's 7 days postpartum," Adrian said, his voice low. "I know," Marcus replied. "She can't travel safely." "I know. She has no reason to disappear." Marcus looked directly into Adrian's eyes, delivering the words with quiet certainty. "Perhaps she believed she did." Adrian's heart sank at those words, the first crack of understanding beginning to form beneath his shock and anger. "What does that mean?" he asked. Marcus withdrew a small envelope from inside his coat. "She left this." Adrian opened it with trembling fingers, finding only 7 words inside, written in Mara's unmistakable handwriting. "If you love our children, don't come looking for me." His fingers tightened around the paper as he read the second line beneath it, one that turned his blood cold. "They are watching you." Adrian looked up sharply. "Who?" Marcus shook his head. We don't know. Find out, Adrian ordered. Yes, Your Majesty. And bring my wife home. Marcus did not move immediately, hesitation flickering across his features once more. Did you hear me? Adrian's voice carried unmistakable danger now. Yes, Marcus said, taking a step toward the door before stopping abruptly. There is something else, he said quietly. Adrian turned back toward him. What? The Queen's maternal access to the Royal Medical Registry was revoked yesterday. Adrian's expression went completely blank. By whom? We don't know, Marcus admitted. Find out, Adrian said again, his voice tight with restrained fury. Marcus nodded and left the room without another word, leaving Adrian standing motionless in the sudden, heavy silence that followed. Celeste watched him carefully before speaking again. She may have done this because she knows about our engagement, she offered. Adrian slowly turned toward her. Our engagement hasn't been announced, he said. Celeste's eyes flickered briefly. Not officially. That single sentence planted the first seed of genuine doubt inside Adrian's mind, because only a handful of people within the entire palace knew about that arrangement, and somehow, impossibly, Mara had known as well. Back at Blackwood Palace, Mara was already miles away, her royal carriage moving steadily along a forest road beneath a heavy, relentless storm. She sat in the back with both infants wrapped securely against her chest, Dr. Miriam Hale seated across from her, watching the exhaustion carve deeper lines into the young queen's face with every passing mile. You need to rest, Miriam urged gently. I will, Mara replied, though both women understood the promise for what it was. You've said that for 3 hours, Miriam pointed out. Mara looked down at Lucas, sleeping peacefully despite the carriage's constant motion. You can't know, she said quietly. Miriam frowned. Who? Adrian. Why? Mara reached into her coat and withdrew a small black notebook, its pages filled with everything she had managed to gather in the weeks leading up to that night. Copied medical records, council orders obtained through careful, patient effort, names cross-referenced with dates that formed a pattern too precise to be mere coincidence. And one particular document that made Miriam's face lose all its color the moment she saw it. Where did you get that? Miriam asked, disbelief evident in her voice. From the nursery registry, Mara answered simply. Miriam stared at the page in front of her. This is impossible. No, Mara said, turning to the next page. This is real. The document revealed that the council had quietly classified the newborn twins not as children, but as royal assets, a distinction that carried devastating legal implications Mara had only fully understood after weeks of careful, secret investigation. Beneath that chilling classification sat a transfer order, scheduling the twins for a bloodline examination exactly 14 days after their birth. Miriam whispered the words aloud, almost unable to believe them. Day 14. Mara nodded slowly. Exactly. What happens on day 14? Miriam asked. Mara looked toward the rain-streaked window, watching the dark forest pass by in silence for a long moment before answering. I don't know, but you left before finding out, Miriam pointed out. I left because I knew enough, Mara replied firmly. Miriam studied her carefully. What do you know? Mara's voice dropped, carrying a weight that had been building inside her for weeks. The council doesn't want my children. She looked down at Lucas again, tightening her hold on him slightly. They want something inside their blood. At the hotel, sleep proved impossible for Adrian as the hours stretched on. He read Mara's note again and again, the second line burning itself deeper into his mind with every repetition. They are watching you. He finally summoned Marcus back to the room. Come back, he ordered over the communication line, and within minutes, Marcus returned, his expression carefully neutral despite the tension radiating from the king before him. Adrian placed a note on the table between them. "Search the palace," he said. "We already are," Marcus replied. "Search every room." Marcus nodded. "And search the medical registry," Adrian added. "We did." Adrian's eyes narrowed sharply. "Then search again." Marcus hesitated before finally speaking. "Your Majesty." "What?" Adrian demanded. "There was another document," Marcus admitted quietly. Adrian looked at him directly. "The council issued an emergency order this morning." "What order?" Adrian asked, his voice carrying an edge of barely restrained fury. Marcus placed it carefully on the table. Adrian read the first paragraph, his expression shifting almost immediately from anger into something colder, more dangerous entirely. It authorized the recovery of the royal heirs. It described Mara as emotionally unstable following childbirth. It instructed royal guards to retrieve the children on the council's authority. Adrian's jaw tightened as he continued reading. "She hasn't been examined," he said. "No," Marcus confirmed. "Who declared her unstable?" Adrian demanded. Marcus did not answer, unable to provide a response. Adrian looked toward the signature at the bottom of the page. The document carried the official council seal, but something immediately struck him as wrong. His own approval line remained conspicuously blank. "They want me to authorize this," he said slowly, understanding settling over him with growing horror. "Yes," Marcus confirmed quietly. Adrian folded the document deliberately. "Burn it," he ordered. Marcus looked visibly surprised. "Your Majesty?" "You heard me," Adrian said, walking toward the window as the weight of everything unfolding began pressing down on him with unbearable force. For the first time since the crisis began, fear replaced the anger that had been driving him, because Mara had not simply run away in a moment of postpartum exhaustion, as the council so conveniently suggested. She had escaped something. And if she had been frightened enough to take two newborns into a violent winter storm rather than remain inside the palace walls, then perhaps, Adrian realized with growing dread, he had been wrong about far more than he had allowed himself to consider. Mara's carriage finally reached an old healer's station shortly before sunrise, the horses exhausted and the storm showing no signs of relenting. Mara could barely stand upright by the time they arrived, her body still recovering from childbirth and now pushed to its absolute limits by days of travel through brutal conditions. Miriam helped her inside gently. "Sit," she instructed firmly. "I need to know whether we're being followed," Mara insisted. "Let me check," Miriam replied, stepping back out into the storm to survey their surroundings. Mara looked down at the twins in the dim light of the healer station. Lucas remained asleep, undisturbed by the chaos surrounding him. Lyra, however, was awake, her tiny eyes following her mother's face with an intensity that seemed almost too knowing for an infant only days old. Mara kissed her daughter's forehead gently. "I promise," she whispered, though she could not yet be certain what exactly she was promising, only that she intended to keep it no matter the cost. Outside, Miriam returned a few minutes later. "No riders," she reported. Mara exhaled slowly, allowing herself a brief moment of relief. But then she heard something carried faintly on the wind, a distant howl, low and controlled in a way that immediately set every instinct in her body on high alert. Miriam froze beside her. "That isn't a wild wolf," she said quietly. Mara stood immediately. "How close?" Miriam looked toward the tree line, her expression tightening. "Very." Outside, the carriage driver suddenly shouted a single word that sent ice through Mara's veins. "Riders." Mara's blood turned cold instantly. She grabbed both twins, securing them against her chest with practiced urgency. Miriam looked at her, panic beginning to show through her usually composed exterior. "What do we do?" Mara moved quickly toward the far side of the healer's station, pulling open a hidden door she had discovered during earlier preparations for exactly this kind of situation. Behind it lay a narrow tunnel, dark and uncertain, but offering the only real chance of escape available to them. "Run," Mara said, and together they disappeared into the darkness just as the sound of approaching hooves grew unmistakably closer outside. The tunnel stretched further than either woman had anticipated, its walls damp and narrow, forcing them to move carefully despite the urgency driving them forward. Mara held both children tightly against her chest, whispering soft reassurances she was not entirely certain she believed herself, focused entirely on placing one foot in front of the other despite the exhaustion threatening to overwhelm her with every step. Behind them, faint shouts echoed through the healer station they had just abandoned, the riders discovering the empty structure and beginning their search for the hidden passage Mara had gambled everything on finding in time. They emerged nearly an hour later into a hidden grove several miles from where they had begun, the storm finally beginning to ease as dawn broke fully over the mountains. Miriam collapsed against a nearby tree, utterly exhausted from the ordeal, while Mara remained standing, forcing herself to stay alert despite every instinct in her body demanding rest. "We can't stay here long," she said quietly. Miriam nodded weakly. "Where do we go?" Mara looked toward the distant mountains rising through the thinning clouds. "There's a cabin," she said. "Abandoned. My family used it once, long before the war took them from me. No one else knows it exists." Together, they continued their journey, the twins remaining remarkably calm throughout the ordeal despite the danger surrounding them, as though some instinct within them understood the necessity of their mother's careful, quiet strength. Back at the palace, Adrian returned alone, the weight of everything unfolding settling heavily across his shoulders as he made his way toward the nursery that had, only days earlier, been filled with warmth and quiet happiness. The room remained exactly as Mara had left it, two empty cradles standing side by side, a single folded blanket resting where she had left it, the small wooden wolf toy she had carved sitting beside the fireplace. Untouched since the night everything changed. Adrian picked it up carefully, his fingers trembling slightly as he studied the careful craftsmanship Mara had poured into something so small and simple. Then he noticed something beneath the cradle that immediately caught his attention. A loose floorboard positioned just slightly out of alignment with the others surrounding it. Adrian knelt down and pulled it up carefully, revealing a hidden compartment built into the floor itself. Inside sat Mara's notebook, the very one she had used to compile everything she had discovered over the preceding weeks. He opened it slowly, the first several pages containing ordinary pregnancy notes, names she had considered for the twins, small medical observations recorded in her careful handwriting. But as he continued turning pages, the content shifted dramatically, revealing the council documents she had gathered in secret. His eyes moved rapidly across the pages, absorbing information that painted an increasingly disturbing picture. One name appeared repeatedly throughout the documentation, connected to payments, orders, and communications that formed an unmistakable pattern of deliberate manipulation. Elder Magnus Rowan. Adrian stopped completely, the realization settling over him with crushing weight. Magnus, the very man who had sat across from him at the hotel only hours earlier, discussing succession and stability as though those conversations existed independently of everything else unfolding around his family. Adrian turned another page, discovering a detailed payment record. Then another still, each one documenting money transferred to various palace staff members over the preceding months. Medical personnel, palace guards, registry officials responsible for maintaining the very records Mara had suspected were being manipulated against her. Beside one particular payment, a handwritten note caught his attention immediately. Ensure Queen Mara is removed before day 14. Adrian's breathing stopped entirely as he processed the implications of what he was reading. This had never been a simple matter of council disapproval or political maneuvering around succession. This had been a carefully orchestrated plan, executed with patience and precision, designed to remove Mara from the palace entirely before some critical deadline the council had established. He turned another page, finding a handwritten sentence from Mara herself near the bottom, clearly written during a private moment when she believed no one else would ever read it. I don't know whether Adrian will believe me. Below it, a second line that struck him even harder than the first. But if he doesn't, our children will never be safe. Adrian closed his eyes, the full weight of his own failures finally becoming impossible to ignore. He remembered their argument in the nursery, remembered the desperate look in her eyes as she tried to make him understand something he had dismissed as simple exhaustion. He remembered telling her she was overwhelmed, remembered choosing his meeting over her fear, remembered every small moment where he had prioritized his own certainty over her instincts. And suddenly, standing alone in the empty nursery with his wife's notebook trembling in his hands, he understood with painful clarity that she had never been trying to control him or undermine his authority. She had been begging him to listen, and he had failed her completely when she needed him most. Adrian summoned Marcus immediately. "Bring Elder Rowan to me," he ordered. Marcus looked visibly concerned. "He's at the hotel, Your Majesty." "I know," Adrian replied. "And Celeste?" Marcus asked carefully. "Bring her too." Within the hour, Magnus stood before the Alpha King in the palace's private council chamber, Celeste standing quietly beside her father, both maintaining careful composure despite the obvious tension filling the room. Adrian placed the notebook deliberately on the table between them, without a single word of explanation. Magnus' expression shifted the moment he recognized what lay before him, though he maintained his composure remarkably well given the circumstances. "You went through the Queen's private records," Adrian said, his voice carrying a stillness that proved far more unsettling than any shout could have accomplished. Magnus did not attempt to deny it. Instead, he offered the kind of justification powerful men often mistake for genuine reason. "The kingdom cannot be ruled by emotion, Your Majesty," he said calmly. "My children are not politics," Adrian replied. "They're the future of this kingdom," Magnus countered evenly. "And you wanted to control that future," Adrian said, understanding crystallizing further with every word exchanged between them. Magnus' expression hardened slightly. "Your wife was never supposed to be queen." Something inside Adrian shifted dangerously at those words, his wolf stirring beneath the surface of his carefully maintained composure. "Careful," he warned. "She has no bloodline worthy of the crown," Magnus continued regardless. "She has my children," Adrian replied sharply. "Exactly," Magnus said, meeting Adrian's gaze directly. "The council believes the person who controls the heirs controls the kingdom." "And Celeste?" Adrian asked, glancing briefly toward the woman who had remained silent throughout the exchange. "She gives us a legitimate political alliance," Magnus answered without hesitation. In that moment, everything finally clicked into place for Adrian with devastating clarity. It had never truly been about replacing Mara, because Adrian harbored genuine feelings for Celeste. It had always been about removing Mara, because she represented the only real obstacle standing between the council and complete control over the future of the Blackwood bloodline through the twins. Adrian whispered the realization aloud, barely able to comprehend the depth of the betrayal surrounding him. "You used me." Magnus offered a faint, almost apologetic smile. "No," he said quietly. He looked directly at the king he had spent months carefully manipulating. "We used your pride." Those words landed with more force than any physical confrontation could have delivered, striking directly at the core of everything Adrian had built his identity around for his entire life. Mara and Miriam finally reached the abandoned mountain cabin as darkness began settling over the surrounding peaks once more. The structure weathered but intact, exactly as Mara remembered it from childhood visits with her own family long before tragedy had claimed them. The twins remained safe throughout the difficult journey, though Mara herself had reached a level of exhaustion that left her barely able to remain standing once they finally arrived. She sat beside the small fireplace Miriam managed to light, watching the flames catch and grow, while both infants slept peacefully nearby, finally settled after the chaos of their journey. For the first time since leaving the palace, Mara allowed herself the vulnerability of genuine tears, the weight of everything she had been carrying finally breaking through the composed exterior she had maintained for days. Miriam sat quietly beside her, offering silent companionship rather than empty reassurances neither of them fully believed anymore. "You still love him," Miriam finally said, breaking the silence gently. Mara looked away, unable to meet her friend's eyes. "Yes." "Then why leave?" Miriam asked softly. "Because love isn't enough if trust is gone," Mara replied, her voice barely above a whisper. Miriam remained silent, allowing the weight of that truth to settle between them without argument, because she understood, perhaps better than anyone else, exactly how much Mara had sacrificed to reach this particular moment of clarity. Mara looked toward her sleeping children. "I wanted Adrian to choose us," she said quietly. "And if he doesn't?" Miriam asked carefully. Mara wiped away her tears, steadying herself with visible effort. "Then I'll choose them." A sound suddenly came from outside the cabin, footsteps crunching against snow that had not entirely melted despite the passing days. Mara stood immediately, every protective instinct within her rising to the surface at once. Miriam quickly extinguished what remained of their small fire, plunging the cabin into near-total darkness as they waited, breathless, for whatever was approaching outside. Then a voice broke through the silence, familiar and unmistakable despite the exhaustion evident within it. "Mara." Her heart stopped completely at the sound of his voice. "Adrian." She opened the door slowly, uncertain what to expect, and found him standing in the snow outside, looking nothing like the confident, composed king who had left the palace only days earlier. His coat was covered in frost, his eyes red and heavy from days without proper rest, his entire posture carrying none of the commanding presence he typically projected without effort. "You shouldn't be here," Mara said, stepping backward instinctively. "I know," he replied. "You were told not to come." "I know." "Then why did you?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly despite her efforts to remain composed. Adrian looked past her briefly toward the twins before answering. "Because I finally understood why you left." Mara's eyes filled with tears she had been suppressing throughout their entire journey. "You don't understand," she said. "I do," he insisted gently. "No," she said, shaking her head firmly. "You didn't listen to me when I begged you to." "I know," he admitted. "You chose the council," she continued, the accusation carrying years of accumulated frustration despite only days having passed. "I know. You believed I was simply emotional." "I know." "And now?" she finally asked, searching his face for any sign of genuine understanding. Adrian swallowed hard before answering, his voice carrying more vulnerability than she had ever witnessed from him. "Now I know I was wrong." Mara stared at him, momentarily unable to respond as she processed the sight before her. The king who commanded armies without hesitation, who had built his entire identity around strength and certainty, now stood before her stripped of every defense he typically relied upon, offering nothing but painful, honest truth. Then Adrian said something that broke through the last of her carefully maintained composure entirely. "I didn't lose you the night you left," he said quietly, his voice breaking slightly on the final words. "I lost you the moment I chose my pride over your fear." Mara found herself unable to speak, the weight of his admission settling over her with unexpected force. Adrian took a slow step closer, careful not to overwhelm the fragile moment forming between them. "I won't ask you to forgive me tonight," he continued. He lowered his head slightly, humility replacing the pride that had defined so much of their recent conflict. "I only came to tell you that nobody will ever take these children from you again. Even if I don't return?" Mara asked quietly, testing the sincerity of his words. Adrian looked directly into her eyes, his answer immediate and unwavering. Even then, in that single moment, standing together in the freezing night with the fragile remains of their marriage hanging delicately between them, Mara finally understood the fundamental difference between a man attempting to reclaim his wife out of obligation or pride and a man genuinely working to earn the right to become her husband again, regardless of whether that effort ultimately succeeded. But their reunion, however meaningful, was not permitted to remain peaceful for long. Magnus, unwilling to accept the failure of his carefully constructed plan, had ignored every order Adrian issued upon discovering the truth. He wanted the twins secured under council authority regardless of the king's wishes, and he was no longer willing to wait for permission that would clearly never come through legitimate means. Before dawn fully broke over the mountains, council forces arrived at the cabin's location, having tracked Adrian's movements after his departure from the palace. The small structure that had briefly offered safety and reconciliation suddenly found itself surrounded on all sides. Adrian stepped outside without hesitation the moment he sensed their approach, positioning himself firmly between the advancing forces and everything he had traveled so far to protect. "You can't fight them alone," Mara said from behind him. Lucas held securely against her chest, while Miriam remained close to Lyra inside the cabin. "I won't have to," Adrian replied with quiet confidence. Moments later, the surrounding forest erupted with movement as hundreds of Blackwood wolves emerged from the tree line, summoned the instant Adrian had understood the full scope of the danger facing his family. Marcus stood at the front of the assembled forces, having anticipated exactly this outcome and prepared accordingly during the hours Adrian had spent confronting Magnus back at the palace. "You called?" Marcus said simply, his loyalty evident despite the danger surrounding them all. Adrian looked toward the mountains surrounding them, his voice carrying the full weight of royal authority once more. "Protect the queen." Mara watched him in that moment, and for the first time in longer than she could clearly remember, she allowed herself a genuine smile despite the danger still very much present around them. The confrontation that followed tested the loyalty and discipline of every wolf present, council forces clashing against Blackwood loyalists across the snow-covered clearing surrounding the cabin. But Adrian issued one instruction above all others before the fighting truly began in earnest, an order that would ultimately define the character of the kingdom he intended to rebuild in the aftermath of everything Magnus had attempted. "No killing unless absolutely necessary," he commanded. Marcus looked visibly surprised by the directive given the circumstances. "You're certain?" Adrian nodded firmly. "This kingdom has suffered enough because people believed power meant taking whatever they wanted without consequence." He looked toward Mara one final time before turning fully toward the approaching conflict. "Today, we prove that it doesn't." The battle that followed lasted through the remaining hours of darkness, Blackwood loyalists systematically overwhelming Magnus' forces without resorting to the unnecessary bloodshed Adrian had explicitly forbidden. By the time the first true light of morning broke over the mountains, the council's attempted coup had collapsed entirely under the combined weight of loyal wolves and the undeniable evidence Mara had risked everything to gather. Magnus himself was taken into custody without significant resistance, his carefully constructed plan having ultimately failed against the very loyalty and love he had so severely underestimated throughout his months of patient manipulation. But even after the immediate danger had passed, one crucial question remained unanswered, weighing heavily on both Adrian and Mara as they finally returned to the safety of Blackwood Palace together with their children. Day 14. It was Dr. Miriam Hale who eventually uncovered the full answer, spending weeks researching ancient council archives that had been deliberately buried and forgotten by previous generations. The council, she discovered, had revived an old and rarely used bloodline ceremony, one specifically designed to determine, on the 14th day following birth, whether an heir carried the exceptionally rare royal wolf gene passed down through only a handful of confirmed bloodlines across the kingdom's long history. If the twins had been confirmed to carry this gene, the council intended to use that discovery as legal justification for claiming direct authority over their upbringing, effectively stripping both Adrian and Mara of any meaningful control over their own children's future development and education. It had never truly been about tradition or ceremony at all. It had always, from the very beginning, been about consolidating power through whatever means proved necessary. When Adrian finally understood the complete scope of what had been planned against his family, his anger gave way to something considerably heavier and more reflective. They were willing to destroy our family for the sake of control, he said quietly one evening, reviewing the documentation Miriam had compiled alongside Mara's own notebook. Mara shook her head gently, offering a correction that carried its own painful truth. No, she said, they were willing to convince us to destroy it ourselves. In that single observation, the true nature of everything they had endured together became painfully clear to both of them. The council's greatest weapon throughout the entire ordeal had never been political influence, manipulated documents, or even the armed forces they eventually deployed against the cabin. It had been distrust itself, carefully planted and patiently nurtured until it grew large enough to nearly tear an entire family apart from the inside, without the council ever needing to lift a single hand directly against them. In the months that followed the confrontation, the kingdom underwent significant and lasting change. Magnus and the council members who had actively participated in a scheme were formally removed from their positions, facing consequences appropriate to the severity of their attempted manipulation of the royal succession. The medical staff and registry officials who had accepted payment in exchange for falsifying records faced their own consequences as well, ensuring that the corruption uncovered during the crisis would not simply be forgotten once the immediate danger had passed. Celeste Rowan, the woman who had once been positioned as Adrian's potential future queen through her father's careful maneuvering, ultimately chose to leave the palace entirely rather than remain within a political structure that had so thoroughly betrayed the trust of everyone involved. Before her departure, she sought out Mara for what would prove to be their final conversation. I hated you, Celeste admitted honestly, her composure carrying none of the calculated elegance she had displayed during their earlier encounters. Mara said nothing initially, simply allowing Celeste the space needed to continue. I believed you had taken something that rightfully belonged to me, Celeste continued. Mara finally spoke, her voice calm and entirely without the bitterness Celeste had perhaps expected. It never belonged to either of us, she said simply. Celeste nodded slowly, genuine understanding finally settling over her features after months of resentment carefully cultivated by her father's ambitions. "I know that now," she admitted. With that acknowledgement, Celeste left the palace permanently, choosing to build an entirely independent life separate from the political ambitions her family had spent years attempting to force upon her. As for Adrian himself, he never once asked Mara to simply forget everything that had happened between them, understanding intuitively that such a request would be both unreasonable and ultimately damaging to whatever trust they might eventually rebuild together. Instead, he chose to demonstrate, through consistent daily action rather than empty promises, that he had genuinely learned from the devastating consequences of his earlier failures. He attended every subsequent medical appointment concerning the twins without exception, regardless of whatever council business might otherwise have demanded his attention. He woke consistently in the middle of the night whenever either child cried, refusing to allow Mara to carry the particular burden entirely alone as she had so often done during the earliest, most difficult days of their infancy. He paused important council meetings the moment Mara indicated she needed him, no matter what pressing matters waited on the other side of that closed door. And whenever remaining council members attempted to dictate what priorities a proper king should maintain, Adrian consistently learned to first ask his wife what she genuinely believed was right before making any decision capable of affecting their family's well-being. One quiet evening, several months after the crisis had finally been resolved, Mara found him sitting on the nursery floor, both twins sleeping peacefully against his chest in a position that had become increasingly familiar over recent weeks. "You look tired," she observed softly, settling down beside him. "I am," he admitted honestly. "You're the Alpha King," she teased gently, echoing words spoken between them long before everything had changed so dramatically. Adrian smiled, genuine warmth softening the exhaustion evident in his features. "Apparently, that doesn't make me an expert in newborns." Mara laughed at the familiar exchange, the sound carrying the same warmth he had missed desperately during every single day they had spent apart during the crisis. Years later, once the twins had grown old enough to understand at least some portion of what their family had endured together, Adrian would sit them down and share the truth with them. Though carefully omitting certain painful details he judged unnecessary for young minds to fully absorb. He would tell them that love without trust can slowly transform into its own particular kind of prison, regardless of how genuine that love might otherwise be. He would explain that pride carries the potential to destroy things far more valuable than anything money or political influence could ever hope to replace. And he would emphasize that sometimes the person who chooses to walk away during moments of crisis is not someone who has stopped loving those they leave behind, but rather someone who has finally understood, often through painful necessity, that they must actively protect both themselves and those depending entirely upon them, particularly when no one else appears willing or able to do so. Mara, in turn, would teach their children something equally important but distinctly different from her own perspective. She would explain that forgiveness does not require pretending that painful events never occurred, nor does it demand forgetting the genuine hurt experienced during difficult periods. It simply means consciously choosing, with clear and honest understanding of everything that transpired, what genuinely deserves another opportunity moving forward. Adrian would never forget the particular night when everything had nearly collapsed entirely beyond repair. The night he had stood inside a hotel suite alongside another woman, discussing his own family's future as though it constituted nothing more than a straightforward matter of political policy. The night his most trusted beta had delivered news capable of shattering his previously unshakable understanding of his own strength and control. The night he had genuinely believed, with absolute and devastating certainty, that he had irretrievably lost everything that had ever truly mattered to him, only to eventually discover that the family he had feared was permanently slipping beyond his reach had, in reality, been fighting with everything available to them simply to survive long enough for the truth to finally emerge. Years passed following those events, the kingdom gradually healing from the corruption that had nearly torn it apart from within. One particular afternoon, while the family gathered together in the palace gardens, enjoying a rare moment of uncomplicated peace, young Lucas turned toward his father with a question that had clearly been developing within him for some considerable time. "Dad?" he asked. "Yes," Adrian replied, looking up from where he sat comfortably beneath the same oak tree where he had once confessed his feelings to Mara so many years earlier. "Why did Mom leave you?" Lucas asked directly, the innocent bluntness of childhood cutting straight to the heart of the matter without hesitation. Adrian glanced across the garden, watching Mara laugh softly as Lyra chased butterflies through patches of afternoon sunlight filtering through the surrounding trees. He smiled gently before finally answering his son's question. "Because I forgot something important," he said. "What?" Lucas pressed, genuine curiosity evident in his young voice. "That being powerful doesn't always mean you're right," Adrian explained carefully. Lucas considered this answer thoughtfully for a long moment before responding. "So you were wrong?" Adrian laughed, the sound carrying genuine warmth and none of the defensive pride that might once have colored such an admission. "Very wrong," he confirmed. Lucas thought further before asking his final, most pressing question. "Did Mom forgive you?" Adrian looked toward Mara once more, watching her laughter continue to carry gently across the garden toward them. "I don't think forgiveness is something you receive just once," he said quietly, choosing his words with evident care. "I think it's something you earn every single day, through every choice you continue making afterward." As though sensing the weight of this particular conversation, Mara turned and met Adrian's gaze from across the garden, and in that brief, quiet exchange between them, years of accumulated pain, difficult distance, and eventual genuine healing passed silently but unmistakably between two people who had ultimately chosen, deliberately and repeatedly, to find their way back toward each other. There are moments throughout life when we mistake someone's silence for outright betrayal. We mistake their necessary distance for simple rejection. We convince ourselves too easily that a person's decision to leave automatically means they have stopped loving us entirely. But the truth, as Adrian and Mara's story demonstrates so clearly, is frequently far more complicated than these simple assumptions allow. Sometimes people choose to walk away precisely because remaining would have ultimately destroyed them, or those depending upon their protection, entirely. Sometimes pride keeps two people separated long after genuine love has already quietly found its way back toward forgiveness and understanding. And sometimes the most valuable lesson available to us isn't found in desperately chasing down the person who chose to leave during a moment of crisis. It's found instead in the deliberate, ongoing work of becoming the kind of person they can eventually, safely, choose to return home to. Adrian believed, in his initial anger and confusion, that his wife had betrayed him entirely. Mara believed, based on painful past experience, that her husband would never genuinely believe her account of events, even if she managed to share the complete truth with him directly. In the end, both of them proved entirely wrong in these initial assumptions. Because the genuine threat facing their family throughout this entire ordeal was never truly each other, despite how easily circumstances conspired to make it appear otherwise. It was fear, carefully exploited by those seeking power. It was pride, allowed to grow unchecked during critical moments requiring humility instead. And it was the accumulated silence permitted to develop, unchallenged, within the space separating two people who continued loving each other deeply throughout the entire crisis, even during periods when neither could clearly perceive the continuing love through the chaos surrounding them. So if there remains one lesson genuinely worth carrying forward from this particular story, let it be this specific insight. Never make a permanent, irreversible decision while consumed by anger directed towards someone you continue to love. Always choose to ask questions before allowing yourself to assume the worst. Choose consistently to listen carefully before rushing toward judgment. And whenever someone you love expresses genuine fear about a situation, resist the temptation to dismiss that fear simply because you personally cannot yet perceive the danger they clearly sense. Sometimes the person standing directly beside you throughout difficult circumstances can sense the approaching storm long before you yourself ever notice the clouds beginning to form on the horizon. And sometimes the person you initially believe is walking away from you during moments of crisis is, in reality, fighting harder than anyone else involved to protect the very family you both continue to love deeply, despite everything working actively against them. What would you personally have done if you found yourself standing in Adrian's position throughout this story? Would you have ultimately found within yourself the capacity to forgive Mara, even after enduring years believing she had betrayed your trust entirely? Or would the accumulated weight of that perceived betrayal have ultimately proven too heavy for you to eventually set aside? And if you instead found yourself standing in Mara's position, would you have similarly found your way back toward the man you genuinely loved, even after he initially failed to believe you during the exact moment you needed his support and trust most desperately? Let us know your honest thoughts and reactions in the comments below, because sometimes the most genuinely meaningful aspect of any story like this one isn't necessarily found in how that particular story ultimately concludes. It's found instead in the lingering questions that story leaves quietly settled within us, long after the narrative itself has technically reached its conclusion. If this particular story managed to move you emotionally in any meaningful way, please consider subscribing for additional emotional and cinematic Alpha King romance stories, where themes of love, trust, family loyalty, and meaningful second chances continue colliding together in ways you likely won't soon forget. And please remember this important insight above absolutely everything else discussed throughout this story. Sometimes losing someone important teaches you precisely what that person's presence in your life was genuinely worth all along. But learning that same person's true value before you ever risk losing them entirely, that particular achievement represents the real, lasting victory genuinely worth striving toward throughout your own life and relationships.